I know, a league's guide this late into the game mode, but I noticed there are still players struggling to pick a relic for their build. I also wanted to introduce the main premise of the channel, that being sharing a different perspective on how to think strategically about your decisions in game. That being said, let's dive straight into the video. I've come to realize that Leagues is one of those game modes where every decision matters and every choice you make connects back to the others. To make those decisions well, you're going to need more than a list of strong picks. What you're going to need is a strategic way to think through what your build actually needs while you're building it. So in this video, I'm going to walk you through the 4-step decision framework I use for Leagues, how I define the goal, spot the weak points, judge each pick properly, and make sure the build actually has a shape that makes sense. Because from what I've learned, most build problems start earlier than you think. Leagues gives you a lot to work with all at once. You've got relics, regions, combat direction, payoff, route, and account support. And what I kept noticing while putting my build together last season was how easy it is to build something that looks strong on paper, but still feels wrong once you actually start playing it. Usually that comes back to one of two things. Either the build was solving the wrong problem, or it was solving the right problem in the wrong order. So the question I keep coming back to is simple. What does this build actually need right now? Not in theory or later in the game, but this build with this goal at this point in the league. Once that answer is clear, the decisions get a lot easier to judge. Alright, let me give you the full framework first, then we'll go through it together in more detail step by step. Step 1 is defining your goal and your player identity. Ask yourself honestly, what kind of league are you actually trying to play? Step 2 is diagnosing the weak points. Where is the build most likely to struggle if you played it right now? Step 3 is where you judge each pick by what it actually solves, and whether it's filling a real gap or just stacking onto something the build already had covered. Finally, there is step 4, where you give the build structure. This is where we consider an engine, a patch, and a payoff. That's the whole framework. And it works whether you're playing for comfort, speed, PVM, points, or a specific endgame reward. So let's go back to step 1. Define your goal and player identity. Before anything else, be honest with yourself about what you actually want from the league. A lot of bad decisions start with a blurry goal. Maybe you want a relaxed league with steady progress, or maybe you want a build that feels good all the way through. Possibly what you care most about is racing hard for points and pace, or you want to experience a specific combat style. Those are not the same build, so they should not come from the same priorities. Remember, a lot of builds are not weak, they're just built for a different player. I notice people saying they want a comfortable league, but then I find all their choices are built around momentum. Then there are players who want a strong endgame payoff but haven't really thought about what's supposed to carry the build there. And if you want a smooth league, you can't keep picking things that only pay off later. The goal is not just background context. It's what tells you whether a pick is actually good for your build. If pace matters most, then we have to take into consideration that early bursts and routing matter more. A great example we can look at are players that are rushing for Dragon Cup. If you're going after comfort, you need to prioritize supplies, sustain, and flow. This is where Butler's Bell makes sense. If you want consistency across the whole league, the bridge matters more than the ceiling. And finally, if combat identity is a priority, you might have to let go of some early flexibility. So before anything else, get clear on what you are actually playing toward. Next up, let's look at step 2, which is diagnosing the weak points of the build. Once the goal is clear, the next question is, where is this build most likely to struggle? This is the step that usually makes the biggest difference, because until you play it, you're still theory crafting, and theory loves flattering itself. The way I keep this simple is by checking 6 areas. First is pace. How quickly does this build turn early tasks into real momentum? If the pace of the build is weak, the whole league feels like it hasn't properly started yet. Second is routing. How much time is this build losing moving from one place to another? Travel, banking, boss access, all of it. So a build can look efficient on paper and still bleed time in the route. Third is resources and sustain. We've got money, herbs, food, secondaries, ammo, prayer. This is basically your uptime. This is the account fuel. When that's shaky, the build keeps stalling in the wrong moments. Fourth is the combat bridge. How clean is the move from early account progression into Slayer, bosses, and real PVM? A lot of builds have a nice destination later, but very little carrying them into it. Fifth is account utility. How much of the count actually feels usable? So we need to consider skilling, task difficulty, training flow, and general flexibility. Some builds are meant to be narrow, and that's fine. But if too much of the account feels awkward, that cost is going to show up later. And sixth, we have payoff. What is the build actually building towards? And how long before that payoff feels real? A strong later reward is not the same thing as a build that feels good on the way there. That's the diagnosis. You're not trying to solve everything at once, you're trying to find the weak point that matters most right now. Once you know the weak points, you can judge the next decision properly. In step 3, we judge each pick by what it actually solves. I keep this part pretty simple. You want to categorize your picks under the following 5 labels. Starting with unsolved, means nothing is really covering yet. It's pretty self-explanatory. Next, we have low. This is for the picks that feel like there is something there, but it's awkward, late, or unreliable. Then we have partial. Here the build can get by, but only if other things also go right. This is the one people miss all the time, and it's oversolved. Oversolved means the build kept stacking into an area that was already handled, while something else is still sitting there open. Each pick might look strong on its own, thanks to Jagex who knows how to sell those relics and echo rewards. The build becomes uneven because the weight is in the wrong place. That is the whole point of judging your picks. You're checking what is covered, what is still open, and whether the next pick is actually fixing something that matters. This same logic is what I use to read a region because a region is doing more than one job at once. I look at it through 4 layers. First is pack tasks. What milestones is the region actually asking for? That tells you what kind of progress the build needs there. Second is the echo reward. A good question to ask is what does the echo boss actually hand you once you get there? That can change how valuable a region really is. Then consider combat direction. Ask yourself, what way is the region pushing the build? Is it reinforcing something you already want? Is it filling a gap? Or is it just piling into something that was already covered? Lastly, we look at account support. Skilling, supplies, routing, basically the general flow of the account. Combat payoff does matter, but a region that drags the rest of the account still has a cost, and that's going to be paid for sooner or later. So the question is not just, is this region good? It's what job is this region doing in this build, and is it arriving at the right time? We prioritize these layers in this manner because pack task tells you what the build has to do to cash in, the echo reward tells you what the payoff actually is, the combat direction tells you the role, and the account support tells you how the account lives within the region. Relics work exactly the same way. Let's take tier 3 as an example. We have Bank Heist, Evil Eye, and Map of Alacrity. They're all strong picks, we're not going to discriminate, but they are not solving the same problem. Bank Heist is about bank friction, so if the route keeps breaking for banking and inventory management, it's a pick that makes sense. Evil Eye is about access and progression into PVM. If the real drag is getting into bosses cleanly, that starts pulling ahead. Map of Alacrity is about movement. If the build is losing too much time just getting from one piece of content to the next, that needs to be taken into consideration. They're the same tier, carrying 3 good picks with 3 different problems being solved. So again, the real question is not which one is strongest on paper, it's where is this build actually leaking the most time or comfort right now. And finally, we're getting into the fun part, step 4, where we get to give the build structure. Once you can analyze the build properly, the next job is giving it shape. The way I go about that is simple, 3 things, engine, patch, and payoff. The engine is what gets the build moving, basically something that creates momentum early. The patch is what fixes the real weak point that would otherwise hold the build back. Maybe the engine is working, but supplies are still bad. Maybe the pace is fine, but the bridge into PVM is still rough. And the payoff is what the build is actually building toward. A combat identity, a bossing path, an echo reward, a late game ceiling. I can't stress enough how much you need all 3. An engine and a payoff without a patch usually means the middle of the league is going to feel rough. An engine and a patch without a payoff can feel stable but has no direction. And a payoff without an engine usually means spending too long in the uncomfortable part of the build. I doubt anyone would want that in a temporary game mode. So to recap, these are the 3 questions I keep coming back to. What gets this build moving? What still needs help? And what is all of this building toward? And the best part is, you can also apply this thought process to the main game. Let's run one build through the framework. Say the goal is a league that feels good across the whole run. It's not a speedrun build or pure late game greed, but a build with a strong ranged payoff later that still feels decent on the way there. So right away that tells you what matters more. Combat bridge, supplies, routing, and general account comfort matter more than squeezing every bit of early burst, right? Now diagnose the weak point. For this kind of build, the early priority is not just speed, it's getting the account moving cleanly and avoiding a weak midpoint. So first, give the build an engine. Abundance makes sense here because it smooths the early account out and gets progress moving without needing the build to spike immediately. Then ask, what am I building toward? That is where a region like Desert starts making sense. It gives you useful progression on the way up and a clearer range direction later. So now the build is becoming clearer. Abundance is the engine, Desert is the payoff. Now you can add the patch. In this kind of setup, supplies and long-term account fuel are often still the real pressure point. That is where Friendly Forager starts making a lot of sense, mainly for your herb and potion supplies. And eventually, the build reaches a later decision point like tier 3. You apply the same logic again. At that stage, the question is no longer what is the engine, it is what problem is still most real right now. If routing is the drag, Map of Alacrity starts making sense. If the rough point is getting cleanly into PVM, Evil Eye can pull ahead. If banking friction is worse, Bank Heist makes more sense. That's what keeps the logic clean. Same framework, different checkpoint. Now, there are a few traps that I keep seeing over and over on Reddit, the comment sections and build videos, and currently in game. The first one is chasing a strong pick without checking whether it's solving the build's real problem. And I'm sure we've all fallen for this at some point, or we still do. A pick can be genuinely strong and still be wrong for the build. One that we've already discussed earlier is oversolving. This is where you find the build investing into the same lane while something else is still weak. That is how builds end up lopsided. And then there's planning too hard around a payoff without respecting the bridge. This is where you pick a strong destination and find yourself being dragged through the mud on the way there. That gap is easy to miss in planning and very obvious once you are actually playing. Most of these mistakes are catchable early. That is the whole point of having a framework in the first place. So that's it. You start with the goal, you find the weak point, judge each decision by what it actually solves, and last, make sure the build has an engine, a patch, and a payoff. Remember, strong builds solve the right problems in the right order. And once you start thinking strategically, the whole league gets much easier to navigate. If you cannot clearly explain why a decision belongs in the build, it probably needs a second look. Whether you're having fun or aiming for a goal, build it on purpose. Let me know how your league is going, and if you found this insightful, do share in the comment section below. Take it easy and have a good one.